January 6th, 2007, a Saturday night in Knoxville, Tennessee. Two young people got in a car together. They had dinner, they were laughing. They were in that early, stupid, happy stage of a new relationship, only 2 months in, where everything feels a little electric. They were going to a friend's place to watch movies. They never arrived. And what happened between that parking lot and the next morning is the kind of thing that makes you question a lot of things. About people, about justice, about what a city will and won't pay attention to.
Stay with me, because this story doesn't end where you think it ends. It keeps going and getting worse in ways you genuinely would not predict. Channon Christian was 21 years old, senior at the University of Tennessee, majoring in sociology. She had pink high heels she liked. She kept photos in her car. Her iPad had an inscription on it. Channon Christian, Mom and Dad, we love you. She was the kind of kid her parents clearly adored, the kind of detail that hits you in the middle of a court document when you're not expecting it.
Christopher Newsom, Chris, was 23, a carpenter, solid guy by all accounts, athletic. He and Channon had been dating about 2 months. 2 months. They were barely past the phase of figuring out each other's coffee orders, and they were already acting like they'd known each other forever. Saturday night, they had a romantic dinner. Then Channon called her mom around 12:35 in the morning, just checking in, the way you do. Said they were heading to a friend's to watch the movies. That was the last time anyone who loved them heard their voices.
Here's what we know happened next, pieced together from court records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence across what eventually became 8 separate trials. Channon and Chris were in the parking lot of the Washington Ridge Apartments. Chris was standing outside the car, the driver's door open, kissing Channon goodbye or hello or whatever couples do in parking lots at midnight. And then, without warning, multiple men with guns appeared. This wasn't targeted. Let me be clear about that, because it matters. They weren't followed. They weren't chosen because of who they were. They were chosen because they had a Toyota 4Runner, and someone wanted it.
That someone was Lamarcus Davidson. Davidson was 25. He had a history of felony convictions. He lived in a rental house on Chipman Street, about 4 blocks from where he carjacked him. He had accomplices with him, his half-brother Latalvis Cobbins and a man named George Thomas. A fourth man, Eric Boyd, also played a role that night that would take over a decade to fully untangle in court. They put guns in Chris and Channon's faces, forced them into the vehicle. And when another car briefly pulled into the lot and spooked them, instead of running, which a sane person might do, they made a different call. They pushed the couple into the car and drove them away. To Chipman Street.
Now, I'm going to be honest with you. What happened inside that house over the next 48 to 72 hours is among the most disturbing material in American true crime. Not in a sensational way, in a way that is deeply, genuinely hard to sit with. I'm not going to walk you through every detail, because some of it doesn't serve the story, it just causes pain. But I'm not going to sanitize it either, because sanitizing it would be a disservice to Channon and Chris, to who they were, to what was done to them. Both of them were bound, wrists, ankles. Chris had a sock stuffed in his mouth, a sweatshirt tied around his head. Channon was blindfolded. Chris was raped. Then, while it was still dark outside, Eric Boyd walked him out of that house barefoot. No shoes, no socks, no pants, on a cold January night, along a railroad track near the property. And he shot him 3 times. Once in the neck, once in the back, once in the head. Then they poured gasoline on his body and set it on fire.
A railroad employee found what was left of him the next afternoon. The body was still smoldering. Channon was kept alive in that house for what investigators believe was multiple days. She was repeatedly and violently assaulted. When her body was finally found, in a trash can inside the house, the medical examiner confirmed something that is almost impossible to absorb. She was alive when she was put in that can. Bound, wrapped in plastic bags, suffocated. She was 21 years old. Now here's where the story shifts, because the families don't sit around waiting. They can't. Because the police can't even start a missing persons investigation until 24 hours have passed. Channon and Chris were adults, so legally everyone's hands were tied. So while investigators waited, Channon's parents and Chris's parents drove around Knoxville themselves, looking, in the dark, in neighborhoods they'd never had reason to be in.
And here's the detail that will stay with you. Channon's father found her car, parked a few blocks from Chipman Street. He found it because he was just driving, searching, refusing to accept that there was nothing he could do. The car had been wiped down, and that wipe down, that little piece of evidence, the deliberate cleaning of a car that belongs to your missing daughter, told investigators everything they needed to know about where this was heading. Fingerprints still survived on the vehicle despite the cleaning. One print led investigators straight to Lamarcus Davidson. They went to 2316 Chipman Street, and they found Channon.
What followed was one of the most complicated prosecution sagas in Tennessee history. And this is the part of the story that most people skip over, but it's actually where the most insane things happen. 5 suspects, 5 separate cases. And then things started to unravel in ways that had nothing to do with the crime itself. The trial judge, Knox County Criminal Court Judge Richard Baumgardner, was presiding over the cases. He was known as a tough, no-nonsense judge. He told people in court they would be removed if they cried during testimony. He ran a tight room. Verdicts came down hard.
Davidson, the ringleader, was convicted of 2 premeditated first-degree murders, sentenced to death, plus 80 additional years to be served consecutively after the death sentence. Cobbins got life without parole. Thomas got 2 consecutive life terms. Boyd was convicted in federal court as an accessory after the fact. Justice, right? Done? No, not even close. Here's what nobody outside of Knoxville was watching closely enough. While these trials were happening, while families were sitting in courtrooms hearing the worst things a human being can hear about their children, Judge Baumgardner had a secret. He was addicted to prescription pills. Specifically, opioids he was obtaining from a convicted felon in exchange for favorable treatment in unrelated cases. He resigned in March 2011. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation raided a home connected to his drug source. And then the legal system did something that almost defies belief. Because of the judge's misconduct, a new judge was assigned to review the cases. And that new judge, Senior Judge John Carey Blackwood, ruled that he couldn't properly act as a so-called 13th juror given the tainted proceedings. So he granted new trials. New trials for people already convicted of murder, rape, and kidnapping. The victims' families had to go back to court again and again and again. By the time all of this was said and done, Chris and Channon's families had appeared in courtrooms over 280 times. Think about that number. 280 times.
Hugh Newsom, Chris's father, said something in an interview that you can't unhear. He said this was the worst crime Knoxville had ever experienced. He said photographs of the crime scene caused people in the courtroom to pass out. He said the family had been in courtrooms 283 times as of one particular interview. And yet somehow, and this is the part that turns the stomach, they kept showing up. The Christian and Newsom families didn't fall apart publicly. They didn't disappear. They built foundations. They lobbied for legislation. The Chris Newsom Act changed Tennessee law to end the 13th juror rule, the very loophole that allowed convicted murderers to get new trials in the first place. The Channon Christian Act prevented defense attorneys from dragging a victim's personal history into court unless it was directly relevant to the case.
They turned their grief into guardrails, so no other family would have to go through what they went through. Now, there's another layer to this case that you cannot ignore, because people have been arguing about it since 2007, and they're still arguing about it now. The media coverage. When Chris's body was found, and then Channon's, the local news in Knoxville covered it extensively, but nationally, largely silent, for weeks. Some outlets never covered it at all. And people noticed. A lot of people, particularly because the victims were white and the perpetrators were black. And the question that started circulating online, on blogs, forums, early social media, was, if the racial dynamic had been reversed, would this have been a national story? It's a genuinely uncomfortable question, and the honest answer is probably yes. The history of American media coverage on racial violence has patterns that are documented and undeniable. Cases with white perpetrators and black victims have historically received far more national attention than the inverse. Some people used that observation to make a legitimate media criticism. Others used it to push white nationalist narratives. There were actual white supremacist protests organized in Knoxville in 2007 because of this case, which were condemned by the victims' families, by local prosecutors, by the NAACP. The Reverend Ezra Mays, president of the Knoxville chapter of the NAACP at the time, put it plainly. He said it wasn't a black and white issue, it was a right and wrong issue, and the people who committed this crime should pay the full penalty.
Investigators themselves were consistent on one point throughout the entire case. There was no evidence this was a hate crime. It started as a carjacking. It became something monstrous because of the specific people involved, their history, their choices, their cruelty, but it was not racially motivated. That hasn't stopped people from using Channon and Chris as symbols for various political agendas, and that in its own way is another injustice, because Channon and Chris were not symbols. They were people, specific, individual people, with iPods and baseball caps, and parents who drove around Knoxville in the dark looking for them. Let's get back to the legal thread, because it gets even more complicated.
Vanessa Coleman, Cobbins' girlfriend, who was in that house, was convicted of facilitation of Channon's kidnapping, rape, and murder, initially sentenced to 53 years. After retrials triggered by the Baumgardner scandal, her sentence was reduced to 35 years. George Thomas went through a retrial and was convicted on 38 charges, 2 consecutive life sentences. Davidson's death sentence and Cobbins' life sentence survived the retrial challenges. They stayed. But Eric Boyd's case was the one that took the longest. He had been convicted in federal court only as an accessory after the fact, a much lighter charge than what the evidence suggested he actually did. For over a decade, investigators and prosecutors believed he had a more direct role, but the federal charges were the only path available at the time.
Then, in 2018, 11 years after the murders, a Tennessee grand jury indicted Boyd on state charges, full charges: kidnapping, robbery, rape, and murder. In August 2019, a jury convicted him. Eric Boyd was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 90 years in prison. It took 12 years to fully hold all 5 people accountable. 12 years. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about this case. There's a detail in the court documents, a small thing, easy to miss, where it's noted that Channon asked Lamarcus Davidson if she was going to die. She asked him, which means she knew or suspected what was happening. She was fully conscious. She was present. She was someone's daughter, someone's girlfriend, someone's friend. She had plans. She was supposed to graduate in December of that year. Her whole life was right there, 1 semester away.
And she asked if she was going to die. I don't know how you sit with that. I genuinely don't. The house at 2316 Chipman Street doesn't exist anymore. A waste management company bought the lot, demolished the structure, and turned it into a memorial. Because what do you do with a place like that? You can't sell it. You can't rent it. You tear it down and you put something else in its place, and you try to reclaim the ground. Memorials exist throughout Knoxville. A golf tournament in Channon's name, a baseball tournament for Chris. Scholarships have been given out, 42 of them and counting, from the Newsom Foundation alone. The families kept showing up. Every court date, every retrial, every sentencing hearing, every parole consideration, they kept showing up. So where does this leave us? What do you do with a case this brutal, this legally tangled, this politically charged?
I think you start by being honest about what it actually was. This was a random act of extraordinary violence by people who had every opportunity to make different choices. Davidson needed a car. He could have stolen it and let them go. According to the court findings, there was no reason to do what he did. No motive beyond the cruelest expression of power over people who had none in that moment. It became a political football. Both sides of the racial conversation tried to pick it up and run with it. And in the middle of all that, 2 families from Knoxville just kept going to courtrooms. just kept testifying, just kept asking that their kids be remembered as the actual human beings they were. The legal system failed them in almost every way it could. A drug-addicted judge, botched sentencing hearings, retrials for people who were already convicted, 12 years before all 5 perpetrators were fully accounted for.
And still, they kept going. The convictions now stand as follows. Lamarcus Davidson is on death row in Tennessee. Latalvis Cobbins is serving life without the possibility of parole. George Thomas is serving 2 consecutive life sentences. Vanessa Coleman is serving 35 years. Eric Boyd is serving 2 consecutive life sentences plus 90 years. That's 5 people, 8 trials, 12 years of court appearances, 2 new laws on the books in Tennessee, and 2 families who turned the worst thing that has ever happened to them into something that protects other people. That's not a Hollywood ending. It's not satisfying in a way we want these stories to be satisfying. There's no moment of catharsis that undoes what happened.
But Channon and Chris are remembered, specifically, as themselves. Not as symbols, not as political arguments. As 2 young people who had dinner on a Saturday night and had absolutely no reason to believe it would be their last. If there's anything this case does, beyond forcing you to confront how brutal human beings can be to each other, it's to remind you that justice, real justice, is almost never fast. It's almost never clean. It costs the people who love the victims enormous, incalculable amounts of energy and time and pain to keep the system moving forward. And sometimes they're the only ones willing to keep pushing. Channon Christian, Christopher Newsom, Knoxville, Tennessee, January 2007. Remember them. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. If you want more deep dive true crime stories told with detail and respect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.